Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another edition of Hilaal Live. I'm your host, Luqmaan Shadrach. Thanks for watching us on Channel 347. It's Monday, which means it's Mental Health Monday. And last week we covered the topic of grief. Each one's journey is unique through stories and expert insights. We explore healing, understanding, and growth after loss. And we've decided to invite back in studio clinical psychologist, Brother Rafiq Lockhat. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
Jazakallah for coming in. We've gone through a couple of weeks of very valuable advice with various topics, and the topic of grief needed another episode as well, because there's so much more that we need to talk about. But for those that maybe didn't join us last week, let's do a brief recap of what we explored last week.
So last week we spoke about that the one thing all of us will at some point deal with in our life is loss of a loved one.
Mm-hmm.
And we said for the purposes of this program, we'll just focus on loss of a loved one. There are other kinds of grief, but for today and last week. And that it's inevitable that we're going to have to deal with that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's probably the biggest loss we'll ever deal with.
Right.
The loss of a loved one compared to, say, loss of a car or loss of a job. Loss of a job is traumatic, but loved one, that's permanent.
Of course.
And so last week we spoke about that there are the difference between mourning and grief.
Mm-hmm.
So grief is an internal process,
mm-hmm.
and mourning is the external expression of that. Right? And so each culture has had different mourning rituals,
mm-hmm.
And we mustn't confuse the two. Then also, we said last week, grief is very personal. Okay, so you can't look at another person and judge how they're grieving and compare to, say, maybe how you grieve. And I made a joke last week. I've been to funerals where I've seen people putting onions, to make themselves cry.
Right.
And I understood that's because they want to fit into the norm of, well, oh no, that person's also feeling the loss. His dad, he's passed away, so he's also crying. I want to tell our viewers that that's not how to do it. You can't say, oh, that person's really crying a lot and I'm not, so therefore maybe I'm not grieving properly.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's personal, it's different. Depends on your personality, it depends on your relationship with the person. If you have 4 children in the family and a parent passes away, each person's going to grieve in their own way.
Absolutely.
That will be depending on the relationship they've had with the deceased person and their personality. Right, so that's kind of where we got last week. We didn't quite get onto the different stages. We can get onto that today.
Yeah, I think that's very important to our audience as well. If we chat about maybe the stages of grief, and a large amount of people may want to draw resource from your expertise and wisdom, and to know better on how to handle, and once they identify these stages, they know how to handle things a bit better as well. So what are those stages, Rafiq?
So the first stage, to my knowledge, was written by a woman called Kubler-Ross in 1969, and all of us followed those stages for a while, but it's moved on because that didn't take into account culture, it didn't take into account like the context, the type of passing away. We said last week that there are different types of passing away. Okay, so there was like the example I gave, my own brother, who had a very serious cancer and he was busy on his way out, and I kept imagining that he's not.
Right.
So I didn't prepare enough, in spite of all the objective signs that he was getting sicker and sicker. My brain convinced me he's getting better and better.
Right.
So even though the doctors had said 3 months, when it came to past 3 months and he didn't pass, and I thought, oh good, he didn't die at 3 months. So I was so desperate for him to stay alive, and obviously, and then he passed away 9 months. But even then, it came too soon, came as a shock, because I hadn't prepared. And then you get the other type of deaths where you say goodbye to somebody, they leave, and then the bus knocks them.
Right.
Sudden death, immediately, no preparation. Then you get very traumatic deaths we spoke about. So violent deaths, if you're murdered, or if you commit suicide, you come home, you find your person hanging. If you have a car accident, mangled bodies. So you get very traumatic deaths. And of course, deaths in hospitals. I'll talk about just now, the one thing that people always seem to remember, like vividly, is like the pipes.
Mm.
They come to see the loved one, and they're not used to seeing them with all the pipes and the
Gotcha.
marks and the pipes going to, and that for some reason that gets downloaded quite automatically into the brain. So depending on how the person passes away also determines how you're going to grieve.
Mm.
Now there's something called normal grief and something called complicated grief.
Okay.
Right. So in a normal situation, I think that there's an app in our brain that helps us to cope, to go through the grieving process.
Mm.
In a complicated grief, that process gets stuck. Like for
Mm.
some reason, it just runs out of fuel or it just hits brakes and can't move forward. Okay. So my understanding, slightly different to Kubler-Ross, is that when you get the news of a loved one passing away, close loved one, we just go into shock.
Mm.
And people who've had that happen to them will know, like, you just get that cold, numb feeling. And I think that is the brain's way to protect you from, because often you see in movies, you get bad news, you go, oh, and then you have a heart attack and you die yourself.
Right.
So
Yeah.
that's right. So I think that process of where the brain shuts down, and people who've been through this will know that you get that cold, numb feeling. Everything just shuts down for you to, and then you go into what I call autopilot.
Mm.
So you do what has to be done, but you're not actually there. So you arrange a funeral, you arrange a wassail, you arrange the food, you phone everybody.
It's a almost like a coping mechanism with
Right.
regards to let's get over this phase,
Right.
and then I can mourn or grieve afterwards.
Right. So that first step is just like, I think, shock. Shock, and everybody will know cold, numbness, and then autopilot.
Right.
Okay, do what must be done. Then from there, like, you go into the next stage where almost like that numbness starts to go away now, and now you start to deal with it, the reality of the loss. And many cultures have mourning rituals,
Yes.
okay, to help us cope with that loss. And also the mourning rituals are designed in many ways across all cultures to help people not get stuck in the denial phase,
Gotcha.
because you're forced to deal with it. Sometimes not in the best way, and sometimes you're not ready to go there. But the mourning rituals move you along generally.
Okay.
You know, this is that, then is this, that happens. So the next phase that comes, I believe, is where you start to deal with it. And there are three main feelings. And again, we're generalizing. In all of our discussions, we always generalize.
Of course,
Because
yeah.
and there's always some people say, but that wasn't for me. Of course, it wasn't for you. But in general, the three big feelings, the three boxes. First one is anger. Second one is sadness. And the third one is guilt.
Right.
What's it going to do? So anger, you can't help it. You just feel angry. You feel angry with the world. You feel angry with the doctors. You feel angry with the nurses. Angry with the car driver, the drunk driver. Just lots of anger, and of course, angry at the person that's left you.
Right.
How could you do this to me? Now, of course, a lot of it's irrational, but this is what happens in that phase. The second part is just the loss, right? The sadness of the loss. And the third one is what we call the if-only syndrome. And almost all of us, okay, after a loss, will have an if-only thought. If only, in my case, if only I'd been a better brother, if only I'd done this, if only I'd done
Spent more time with the person.
If only I'd spent time with the person, if only I didn't fight with them so often, if only I'd offered, whatever. So I just want our viewers to know that these are normal thoughts, even though they might seem irrational, but our brain produces them anyway. Now, it's different percentages for different people. So somebody may have 60% anger, like 10% sadness, and then the rest if only. Others may have like 80% if only. So it's just to recognize that in general you will have some of those, or you will have all of those, and you'll have them in different percentages. And even within the same family, it'll be totally different.
Right.
Some will have more guilt, some will have less guilt. Some will have more anger, some will have less anger. So it isn't a homogeneous process in a family. Everybody will grieve depending, again, I said, personality and relationship to the loved one.
Right.
So sometimes, this was I was like daddy's favorite, let's just say.
And in that process, there's some unresolved issues, some people have. That's where the guilt.
Right. So that's where we come to. So we'll talk about therapy shortly. That's the spot on about that. So that's the next phase. Then from there, you go into what I think finally, that you get to then, now you've got to work through those phases. And then you get to accept it. All right. You accept it, at least in this life. Yeah, you're not going to see the person.
Okay. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll continue with that. Yes, that's 12 minutes. When we come back, we chat a bit more to Rafiq Lockhat, a bit more about today's topic, which is grief, how better to handle grief and the various stages, and how to just navigate through life as well. Thanks for watching us on Hilaal Live. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to Hilaal Live. Thanks for watching us on channel 347. We continue our topic with clinical psychologist Rafiq Lockhat, and today's topic is around grief and how better to cope with various situations. Rafiq, Jazakallah once again for coming in. And before the break, we chatted about the different stages of grief as well. And maybe if we can continue with that before we move on to our further discussion.
So I forgot to mention, after that first shock stage, that cold numbness, the next phase comes denial. And denial is where you think, this is a bad dream. We've all had that.
Absolutely.
Like you go to bed and you wake up thinking, everything's back to normal. The world is fine again until you get up and go look for the deceased person, and then they're not there. So that's the second phase. And I remember going to look for my brother. I'd get up in the morning because when he was sick, I used to go and check on him every morning.
Right.
So I just kept doing that. I'd get up, open the door, then I'd go, oh, right, no, he passed away. He's not here. So some people have that. The problem in the denial stage is that it can last a very long time. Like your brain keeps you there, almost as if you keep hoping that it's
easier
not
to
true.
Accept that, to rather
It's almost that it's not true, and so often that's when we withdraw into ourselves as a way of now coping with the loss, and a part of our brain just kind of convinces us that the person's coming back, that it's a bad dream, that we'll wake up, it will all be gone. And then an interesting thing, we often see the person. You walk and you say, hey, that's, and then people say, no, dude, like your brother. No, but it looks just like him, man. So there's almost this need to keep it going. And I want to also say that a lot of times people, in that phase, they keep things of the person. So they'll keep their clothing and they'll go and smell the clothing. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. People might think that's psychotic. It's not. It's just your brain's attempt to keep the person close by. So it's often people will keep a very special thing very close. They won't let anyone touch it. They'll go, they'll hug it, they'll hold it. They just want to smell something to keep themselves connected. A lot of times people will not delete the cell phone number.
Or messages for that matter.
Or messages. Because it's like too final to delete that. And I didn't know. But after a while, the cell phone number gets given away. I didn't know this. So in my case, I kept my brother's number. I wouldn't touch it. And then one day I accidentally pressed it and somebody answered.
Sure.
And I said, who are you? And they said, well, no, who are you? I said, this is so-and-so. They said, no, this is my phone.
Wow.
I remember being like furious. Like, what are you doing with my brother's phone number? So these are not, they seem odd. But they're fairly normal in the context of grief. So then you get to that phase, acceptance. And I said last week, I learned from the person that I worked with many years back at Atlantic, Dr. George Savage, who taught me there's one more phase. That's called readjustment. That is
so vital.
Living life without the dead person. So in Kubler-Ross's stages, it ends when you get to acceptance. That's okay. It's actually not. It's the real challenges. And that's just the psychological part. The real challenge comes in now living life without the person. And the challenge that come with this as a single parent, as maybe they are like not knowing money, there's money issues, there's inheritance issues, which is a nightmare generally. So there's all the things that come after. And often families break apart. as a result of money issues around fighting around inheritance. Maybe the will wasn't left properly.
Right,
So that
yes.
then increases the anger towards the deceased person.
Gotcha. We're chatting with clinical psychologist Brother Rafiq Lockhat on today's topic of grief. Can be a bit sensitive to some people. However, it prepares us on how to handle grief a bit better. Rafiq, we always feel for the kiddos that go through any type of grief, any type of loss of a parent,
Sure.
sibling, aunt, uncle, grandparents for that matter as well. How do we adjust to this? How do we deal as a parent?
Right.
Number one, how do we deal with their grief and try to assist with their grief as well?
Thanks for bringing up the children issue, because it's real big. So often I see adults in my therapy, and they'll talk about how when dad died or grandpa died or whatever it is, they were moved aside.
Yeah.
Now, not on purpose.
Right.
Because there's things to be done. Okay? Remember, funerals require organizing.
Correct.
There's funeral policies.
And
if you have that, there's
you often hear people say, look, I only bump into people at weddings and funerals.
Correct.
So everybody wants to make sure that it runs, according to how it needs to.
Right. So as a parent, you're busy dealing A, with your own grief, B, dealing with the organizing of the funeral. So you don't really have time for the child, not on purpose.
Right.
But often I found adults will say to me, when my granny died or my whatever died, I was just pushed aside. I wanted to go and I wanted to, hug my granny, and I wanted to, say goodbye to her. But they moved me out to this. No, this is for adults. So I want to say to our viewers that maybe don't do that. Right? Allow the child also. Now, children will grieve differently depending on the age range.
Yeah.
Okay, so children is not one thing. Children is a many ages thing.
Absolutely.
Child of 6 and a child of 10, they don't have the same brain. They don't process information the same way. Often children, just before the age of 10, don't have a concept of permanent loss. It's a foreign concept. So somebody gone forever is a odd concept. They wake up the next morning and they say, so where's so-and-so? And they say, well, so a really good place to start with parents is, and I understand it's really tough while you're doing with your own grief, to still also help your child grieve. It's tough.
Right.
It's more complicated, but at some point you have to help the child.
Yeah.
And that would mean simply, so the first step is in what's the cultural acceptance of life, life after death.
Right.
And that helps. If everybody has the same viewpoint, then it's easier to explain to the child. If you have different viewpoints, it's complicated.
Right.
Step one. Step two is to ask the child, what do they think happened? And so the child will then give you an idea about where they are in their understanding. What do you think's happened to dad? And they'll say, well, whatever the child's going to say. So that's a good starting point, because then you know how to arrange your intervention. And then, of course, you have to explain around permanence of loss, etc. But then be prepared to do it again the next day and the next day when the child keeps coming back and say, where's dad? Don't say, I told you. How many times must I tell you this? Well, maybe because, again, depending on the child's age, and often younger children start having difficulties in terms of sleep, concentration, they have nightmares, they wake up crying at night, they become very clingy, right? They look for, can I hang on you? Right? And parents, again, dealing with their own stuff, it's very hard for them to now handle this child who's hanging on them. I'm busy, try and not do that.
Right.
If you're listening, watching, try and not do that. Remember, the child has even less of a brain to make sense of what is happening.
Yeah.
We have a full brain, they have a quarter of a brain. And this is, they just see people crying and they see, their father, grandfather's not there. What's happening? no one's coming to hug me anymore like, Pa always did. Teenagers tend to act out.
Okay.
So they tend to get angry and they tend to fight. They tend to sulk.
Withdrawn.
Right. They tend, but usually they act out.
Okay.
The children get clingy as a general rule. Teenagers tend to act angry, fight. They get in trouble. They get sent home from school. That's the sign. If your teenager wasn't like that, and after the death of a loved one, they've become that, that's a guarantee that they are struggling to deal with that. Okay. So how do we fix this going forward? So fortunately, there's something called there's grief therapy.
Okay.
And the therapy I use is called brain working recursive therapy, or BWRT.
Okay.
And there's a grief protocol that helps us to move people through the process. Where people get stuck is where there's no closure. Okay, so during COVID, we spoke last time, nobody had closure.
Absolutely, yeah.
So if you didn't get an opportunity to say a warm, loving goodbye to your loved one, that file stays open in your brain, and sometimes forever. Okay?
No closure.
No closure. And the aim of the therapy is to remove the intense pain of the loss into normal sadness. Now, normal sadness is normal. You don't need treatment for that. But most people get stuck in the pain.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, when you're in the pain stage, you can't access good memories. Because your brain just keeps going to the bad memory. You saw the person die in a bad way, a robbery, a shootout, a hospital, etc. Your brain keeps wiring to that traumatic memory, which means you can't move forward. And then your brain can't access all the good memories you've had, of which people have many. And they come to me and they say, I can't remember the good times. And I explain, okay, so you're in a lot of emotional pain. The therapy is going to move you from painful to normal sadness. And after that, you won't need me. But that's what we're going to get to do. Because normal sadness, you'll then move on.
Absolutely.
But quickly, after the therapy, you have something called an anniversary reaction. That means on special occasions, your brain will remember the person more. It's not a relapse. So whether it's Eid or Christmas or Diwali or whatever it is, on Father's Day, Mother's Day, a birthday,
big days, special
any
days.
day that was special, on that day, your brain will wire back to the loss. And people think they're relapsing, they're not. It's just what we call an anniversary reaction. There's a spike in sadness. You know, so the first Eid or the first Christmas is an empty chair.
Absolutely.
And then that hits you. But it's not, after successful therapy, I often warn people, I say, this is going to happen. It's not a relapse. It's just your brain on a special day remembering the person, and then it will go down again.
Okay. Rafiq, thanks so much.
Pleasure.
Valuable information, and I'm sure our audience will benefit tremendously from this. Wishing you a lovely evening. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
That's Rafiq Lockhat, clinical psychologist, joining us on Mental Health Mondays. From all of us in Cape Town, Sohail Barnes, Mohammed Parker, and myself, Luqmaan, Shadrach, have a great evening. Assalamu alaikum.